So welcome to the final tutorial, part 4 for the login and register app. In this tutorial we'll set up methods that allow us to request and access data from the server which we created in the last tutorial. So the first thing we need to do is improve something in the main activity. So if authenticate is equal to true, so therefore if the user is logged in, display the user details, and if the user is not logged in, what we want to do is start the login activity. So start activity, we've done this countless times, so it should be easy by now. And we want to open the login.class. So what this does is if the user is not logged in, the login activity will be opened. So now we can get into creating the server request. So what I'd like you guys to do is create a class called server request, like that. So the first thing we need to define in this class is a progress dialog. So what progress dialog allows us to do is to show a loading bar when server requests are being executed. The next thing we need to do is create a constant which is called the connection time. So this is the time in millisecond that the connection should persist for before it stops. So it's the timeout basically. So connection timeout. Next, we need to also create another constant, which is the server address, because we need to access PHP files from the server address. So, and my server address is HTTP. Yeah, I think I copied it. Yep, there it is. That's my server address. So your server address will be different to this. So when you create a free server using 000 web host, you get your own server address similar to this. So now we need to create the constructor, which is the first thing that runs when this is created. In this constructor, what we want to do is instantiate the progress dialog. However, to instantiate a progress dialog, we need a class which extends activity to do this, but server request doesn't extend activity. So what we want to do is all the activities who we use the server request, we'll ask them for their context, so we'll use them to create the progress dialog. So now we can say new progress dialog and then pass our context to it. So now we need to set a few attributes for the progress dialog. So cancelable is going to be false, so the user won't be able to cancel the progress dialog while it's loading. Set title, will make that processing, and finally set a message and we'll call that please wait, let's say. So this instantiates the progress dialog and we set some attributes of the progress dialog. So the next thing we need to do is create two methods which will be called when an activity needs to store a user's data in the server or access a user's data from the server. So for a store user data, and we'll say in background, because if you're accessing this server, you need to do this in the background. And next one will be fetch user data in background, right? So that's that. Next thing I want you guys to do is create another class, and we want to call this get user callback. So I'll show you how this will be used. So what this class would do is allow us to inform the activity which performs a server request when the server request is completed. So we'll name this an interface, because this isn't actually going to implement any method. It's just going to tell the activity which method to use, which method will be called when the server request is completed, and the method that will be done, and its parameters will be user, returned user. So it needs to be an abstract void, and abstract void because it's an interface, and interfaces can only hold abstract methods. And yeah, so you see how this is used later. So close that. So when you store users data in background, the first thing we need in the parameter is the user, and we need to get user callback. Right, so when you fetch a user's data from the background, we also want the user which data is being fetched from the background, and also we want a callback also. So the callback is what we're going to invoke when the user's data has finished storing in the background, or when we finish fetching the user data from the background. So when these methods are executed, we want to start the progress dialog to show that it's being executed. So now we actually have to start the background task now, and on Android the background task is called an async task. So to do this, it's public class, and then you name your async task. I'll just call this store user data async task, and this has to extend an async task like that. And okay, so this has to take a void, and void means we're not sending anything to this task when it's being executed, because we're just going to send it to the constructor rather than sending it to the async task. And a void, the second void, is the how we want to receive the progress from the async task, and in this we don't want to receive the progress. We're simply just going to start the progress dialog when this async task starts, and then close it when the async task finishes. And finally, void, this is what we want the async task to return. Right, so now we need to implement some methods in the async task. So control I, so doing background. So in here, this will be performed in the background when the store user data async task starts. So what we want to do in the store user data in background, so when this method is called, we want to start the async task. So we'll just do new store user data dot execute, and when we're storing the user data in background, we need the constructor of the async task to know certain things. So we need the constructor to know the user whose data is being stored, and we need the constructor to also know the user callback. I'll just call this user callback. So yeah, we also need the constructor to know the user callback, which it should inform when it's finished performing the background task. So we need to set this up. So it's also going to take the same constructors that, yup, and so we want it to take the user from the parameter and take the callback. I just named that user callback. So now we also need to, from this method, we need to send the user's data and the user callback, which we're going to use. So when this method is invoked, it will start the async task and pass it the user, and the callback we want to inform when the async task is finished, and the async task will basically get the user and the user callback. So something else we need to do is control O to see everything, all the methods we can override. So we want to override on post execute. This is what happens when the async task is finished. So when the async task is finished, the first thing we want to do is dismiss the progress dialog, so stop the progress dialog from loading. And second thing we need to do is tell the user callback that we're done. So we basically call done in the user callback, so the activity which started this task will be able to know that it's finished, the background task is finished. I want to pass a no in there. Okay, so now we actually have to start access the server. So to access the server, the first thing we need to do is create the data we're going to send to it. So put in a format where the server will be able to receive it, and so we want this to be an array list, and it should hold a name value pair. The name value pair basically holds a key and holds the data which will be stored in the key, so I'll just call that data to send and call that new array list. Alright, so now we actually have to put the data to send in this array list, so we need to add new basic name value pair. So basically name value pair is just the key which is there and the value we need to store in there. So the key, the first thing we need to store is the name, and the value for the name will be user.name, which will be taken from here. The next thing we need is the username, and we also need the age. But keep in mind the name value pair takes 2 strings, so the age also has to be in a string format. And finally, we need to get the password. So currently the data to send will contain all the information about the user which we want to send to the server. The next thing we need to set up is we need to set the attributes for the HTTP post. So we just say HTTP param, sorry about that, yep, and we'll just call it HTTP request param. So that will be new basic HTTP param. So now we can do things like set the connection timeout in here. So this allows us to basically change the attributes of the HTTP request we're about to make. So let's just say HTTP. To change the timeout time, you do HTTP connections params dot set connection timeout, and we need to put that in there because we're changing the current connection timeout of this HTTP param, and we want to give it the new connection timeout, which is what we set up over here. Now also we need to set something called the set so timeout. Right, so the set connection timeout is the time we want this to run for, the time we want to wait before the post is executed, and the set so timeout is the time we want to wait to receive anything from the server. So that's that done. So we've set up the HTTP request. Next thing we need to do is set up the client. So that's called the HTTP client. Sorry about that. HTTP client, and we'll just call that client. And what the client does is it allows us to basically make requests to the server. So we'll pass it the param in there so it knows the time, the connection timeout. And next thing we need to set up is the HTTP post. So this is what's going to hold the data we are to post to the server. So HTTP post, so it needs to know the server address that we want to post this to. So that's going to be the server address which we defined up here. And since this is a store user data in background, we want to also say register.php. So it's going to call the PHP file we created, the register.php file we created in the last tutorial. So now finally we need to post.setEntity. So this is telling the post the data we want to send to it, and we need to surround this with a try and catch. So try catch, and I'll just catch all the exceptions. So the way to do this, you can't just put the data to send in the set entity, you actually have to encode it. So set, so it will be new, to encode it, new URL encode form entity, and then we give it the data to send. So this will encode the data to send and then give it to the post, so the post knows what it's going to post to the server address which we've mentioned right here. And now finally we use the client to execute the post. So the client will then execute the post. Alright, and we just want to print the stack. So if anything goes wrong, we can use that to know exactly where it went wrong. So this is done now. So this will actually store the user's data in the background. Now we need to do something similar for getting the user's data from the background. So I'll just copy here because we need similar things. So close that. And this will be called fetch user data async task. And change the name of the constructor. Right? But we need this to be a user because the fetch user data async task is actually going to return a user when the background task has finished. So now we need to do the same thing. So Control I to implement that method there, and we also need the post execute. So I'll copy the post execute from the other one because they do the same thing, and this will return a user when the background task is finished. So it will return a user because this is void, because in this one we don't actually have to return anything. That's why we put that void, but here we have to return a user, so this also has to return a user. And what we want to do is put the returned user in there. I'll just change that to returned user. So whatever user is returned from when we're fetching the user data in the background, it will send it to the done, to the user callback done. So the activity that performs this server request will be able to know when it's done, and it's going to also be able to receive the information about the user who has been received from the server. So to do this in the background, we have to do similar things to the first one. So firstly, we need to give the server some information, but to fetch a user's data, all we need is its username and password because we're trying to get its name and age from the server. And now we need to also set up the request again. You can actually just put this in a method and make both async tasks use them, but I'm just going to leave it like this. I'll leave that to you guys to change it. And also we want to set up the client and also the post, but this time we're actually, the address we want is the fetch user data.php. So this is what we set up in the last tutorial. So this so this post will basically call the fetch user data PHP file which we set in the previous tutorial, and that needs the username and the password of the user we're trying to search. So now, same as last time, we need to execute the post. But now when you execute the post, you actually receive a response. So I'll tell you guys how to do that. Give me a second. Yep. So yeah, when you execute the post, you actually receive a response, and it's called a HTTP response. Is that there? Yep. And let's just call this HTTP response. All right. So after you execute this in the background, you will actually receive a response, which is the user's data that matches the username and password. So we'll also get the age and the name of this user. And what we want to basically convert this into a format where we can actually read the data that is inside the JSON. So HTTP entity, this is how we do that. So first we need to get the entity, which is basically the data from the HTTP response, and we need to convert this into a string. So to do that, we just go to string and we give it the entity. And now we need a JSON object to actually allow us to read the different attributes in the JSON file. Because if you remember in the last tutorial, when we're actually sending the data back to the user, we encoded it with JSON. So now this is going to decode it from JSON. So JSON object, and we want it to decode that. So now the J object is actually going to contain the information about the user. So what we want to do is basically, if there's no user, So if it's equal to 0, if the length of the J object is equal to 0, it means there was no user return. So all we have to do is just, actually no, let's first set up a user here. So this is where we're going to store the information about the user which has been returned. So if no user has been returned, we just want to make that null, and at the start we also want to make that null. And if a user has been returned, we need to get the information, the details of this user. So the first thing we need is the name of this user. So we get the name of the user from the J object which we got there. So .get string, and we called it name in the PHP tutorial we did in the last tutorial. And now we just need to get the age. So age and get int, and we call this an age. So now we have that, we can actually say the user is equal to, actually no, we'll call this returned user so we don't get confused by the other user here. So now we can say the returned user, so we need to store the details of the returned user, is equal to new user, and a user takes a name, an age, or username. So we'll just get the username of the user from there, and user.password, because we already know the username and the password of the user, so we can just reuse that here. So basically, just to summarize what happens here, we send a request to the server asking it for a user which has a username and password equal to the username and password that has been sent to this method right here, the fetch user data in background. And then we receive the name and the age of the record that matches the username and password, and we store it in the object right here, in the returned user object. So now all we have to do is just returned user. So this will basically send this to the post execute, and then we can put that in the done method right there. So what we need to do now is execute this async tasks in this method right here, just like we did the last time. So new fetch user data in background, we need to give it the callback, and we need to execute it. So this will execute the file right here. So we have an error somewhere. Let me just look for where that error is coming from. Oh, okay. So okay. Alright. So there, the server request has been set up. So now we can actually go into login and we can actually use this. So when a user clicks the login button, firstly we want the username they've just entered. So et username.getText to string. We also want the password they've just entered. So same thing except password and et password. And now we want to put that in a user object, so like that. And now we want to authenticate. So we want to check if the username and password is correct, and we'll do that right here in the method. So I've created private void authenticate, and we need to pass the user into the method so it knows which user it's authenticating. So now in this method we need to access the server, so we need to create a new server request. So server request, and we need to pass our context into it, so this, and then we need to fetch user data in background, which are the methods so we need to give it the user. Now this is where we get to use the get user callback. So we say new get user callback, and if you click enter you see this done method right here. So after it's fetched the user data in background, this done method will be called, and the parameter in the done method will be the user which was returned to us. So we can say if returned user is equal to null, that means no user has been returned, that means the username and password is wrong. We can show an error message, and I'll set up the error message right here. So private void show error message, and I'll just show error message. And to show a dialog of an error message, all you have to do is create an alert dialog.builder. Okay, .builder. Yep. And so I'll just call that dialog builder and create instantiate it alert dialog.builder. And it needs our context, so we'll just give it that. And wait, like that. Now we just need to set the message in the dialog. So we can set the message to incorrect user detail. So you guys can choose whatever you prefer to put here, but I'm just going to call it incorrect user detail. And we need to set a button for it. So an OK button. So set positive button. We'll call it an OK. And since we don't want anything to happen when the OK button is pressed, we just click on null. We put null in there. Sorry. So nothing happens when the OK button is clicked. The error message just goes away, and now we just need to display the dialog builder. So if the returned user is null, which means the username and password which has been entered is null, an error message will be shown, and if it's not null, which means a user has been returned, which means the username and password is correct, we need to log the user in. So now we need to create this method, private void log user in, and we need to know what user we need to log in, so we'll just give it the parameter. So we're sending the returned user to this method, and now we need to collect the returned user in this method. So now we want to do something with the returned user. So what we need to do with the returned user is we need to store the information about this user in the local store, just like here. So store the information about this user in the local store. So we remove what we put here before. So we store the information about the returned user, and we set that the user is logged in. And now what we need to do is start the main activity. So new intent, because now the user is logged in, we want to display the information to them. So I'll start the main activity, and yeah, that's it with the login. So just to go through that again, the user enters the username and password. We store that in a variable username and password. We create a user object with the username and password. We authenticate the user, and to authenticate the user, we fetch the user's data in the background, which starts showing the progress dialog. So the user won't be able to do anything. They'll just have to wait for the server request to finish. And if the returned user from the server is null, we show an error message. And if it's not null, we log the user in. And to log the user in, we just store their data in the local database on the phone, and we set the user to logged in to show that they've logged in, and then start activity. So we start the main activity to actually show all the details of the user. So now finally we need to use a server request to store the user's data. So to do that, it's actually very simple. Let's create a method here called register user, and I'll just change this to user. Simply make it look better. So register user. Now we need to define the method. So private void register user. We need to collect the argument which has been sent to this method. And now what we want to do is start a new server request again, just like with the login. So new server request. And remember, we need to pass our context to the server request. So now all we need to do is server request dot store user data in background. We need to give it the user which data we're about to store, and also create a get callback so we know when the server request is finished. And in this done method, what we want to do is start the login activity, so the user will be able to log in with the username and password they just created. So we'll give it our context or register.this and open the login activity. So start activity. No, we don't have to. Yeah, we already started the activity. Alright, so that's the register done. So when the user registers, we get the name, username, password, and age of the user, put that in a user object, register the user, and to register the user, we start a new server request, store user data in background. So we give it the user whose data we're about to store in the background, and the get callback. And what you guys can do in your own projects is you can add another parameter to this done method. Let's say a boolean successful or something like that. So you can actually use this to know if if any error occurred while you're storing a user's data in background. But in this tutorial, we're not going to look into stuff like that, but you guys can easily change this to implement that too. And also, finally, what we need to do, since we're accessing the internet, is we need to add a permission to this. So we need to add some permission to this Android app, so it allows us to access the internet. So we just use this permission, and we want the Android permission, the internet, and we just need to close that. So this will allow us to access the internet. So yep, this looks complete. So the user can register, log in, and the server request is here for us to reuse. So thank you for watching my login and register tutorial. So how can you improve this yourself? Firstly, you can hash the password, because you don't want to store a password in plain text. That becomes very easy to hack. And yeah, you guys can come up with creative ways you think this can be improved, and just add in a comment section on the video so other people can look at the improvements. And yeah, if you find any mistakes that I've made, feel free to add that to the comment too, and I'll be able to add annotations to the video to inform other users about, other viewers about this mistake. So thank you guys. I'll be making more tutorials in the future depending on how this tutorial is received. Yeah.